Lecture 2 for the second Sunday in Lent, God, the object of religion. Psalm 42, verse 2. My soul is athirst for God, yea, even for the living God. When shall I come to appear before the presence of God? There is scarcely, even in the Psalter, a more touching psalm than this. The psalmist is probably an exile of the early Assyrian period. In the land of his captivity, he is surrounded by all the institutions of an established idolatry. And as he sadly reflects, he is far removed from the holy home of the race of Israel, from the place which the Lord had chosen to put his name there, from the worship and fellowship of the sacred commonwealth. His thought spans the intervening desert, and he dwells with a full and aching heart on all that lies beyond it. He remembers the festival services in Jerusalem in bygone years, when he went with the multitude keeping holy day, when he too had his share in the voice of joy and praise. As he calls up in memory this cherished part, he pours out his soul in secret grief. And while the cruel heathen around taunt him with the insulting question, "Where is thy God?" he can only find refuge in tears. His tears, as he tells us, flow by day and by night. When will the long years of exile have an end? When will he come to appear before the presence of God? He is like the thirsty stag, panting after the distant water brooks. His inmost being is athirst for God, yea, even for the living God. The living God. What a strange, yet what a pregnant phrase. Surely the author of life must live, yet here is an expression which hints at the idea of deities who are not alive. It was thus that the Hebrews distinguished the true God, who had revealed himself to their ancestors, from the false gods of the nations around them. As for all the gods of the heathen, they are but idols, but it is the Lord that made the heavens. The heathen deities were so much carving, sculpture, and colouring, or they were so much human imagination or human speculation. They had no being independent of the toil, whether of the hands or of the brains of men. They had no existence in themselves. They did not live, whether men thought about them or not. As we should say, they had no objective existence. It was true that evil spirits, by lurking beneath the idol forms, or draping themselves in the debasing fancies of the heathen world, might contrive to appropriate the homage which the human heart in its darkness lavished upon its own creations. And thus the Canaanites are said, in their cruel Moloch worship, to have sacrificed their sons and their daughters unto devils. But the broad contrast latent in the expression, the living God, is the contrast between imagination and fact, between an existing being and a collection of fancy personages, between a solemn truth and a stupid and debasing unreality. We are not here concerned to inquire what elements of truth there may have been in the forms of heathen worship with which the Jews came into contact. Some truth there certainly was in the most degraded of them, since a religion which is pure, undiluted falsehood could not continue to exist as a religion, and the false religions which do exist only exist by virtue of the elements of truth which in varying proportions they severally contain. The lowest fetishism witnesses to the great truth that man must go out of himself in order to seek for an adequate object of his heartfelt devotion, of his highest enthusiasms. And no instructed Christian would deny that certain forms of heathenism embrace incidentally the recognition of considerable districts of fundamental truth. If indeed, as St. Paul says, God teaches all men up to a certain point through nature and conscience, it could not be otherwise. And this intermixture of truth, which is thus latent in all heathenism, affords the best starting point for convincing heathens of the errors which they admit and of the truths which they deny beyond. In this sense, undoubtedly, the science which has been of late named comparative theology may be made really serviceable to the interests of Christian truth. It is a widely different thing to start with an assumption that all the positive religions in the world, the Jewish and Christian revelations included, are alike conglomerate formations in very varying degrees, partly true and partly false, and that the religion of the future, an etherealized abstraction to be distilled by science from all the creeds and worships of mankind, will be something beyond and distinct from all of them. Certainly, heathenism is not treated, either in the Old Testament or in the New, with the tenderness which would befit such an anticipation as this. Practically speaking, and as contrasted with the revealed truth, whether Jewish or Christian, heathenism is represented as a lie. To live within its territorial range is to live in the kingdom of darkness. To practice its rites is to be an enemy to God by wicked works. To go after false gods is to have the earnest of great trouble, and to provoke the anger of the real Lord of the universe. The Assyrian idols did not raise in the exile's mind any question as to the stray elements of truth which might be underlying so much tawdry and impure error. My soul, he cried, is athirst for God, yea, even for the living God. When shall I come to appear before the presence of God? The language of this exile is in truth the language of the human heart, under the stress of the purest and deepest desire that man can know. In this life, man is an exile. He is parted from his true home and country. He is the victim of an unconquerable restlessness. This restlessness of the mind, this wasting fever of the heart of man, this unwillingness to be satisfied with any earthly good, attracted the attention of ancient thinkers, but they did not understand its secret. They would fain have accounted for it by pointing to some fatal warp or flaw in human nature, or they would have silenced it by the tentative guesses of successive philosophies, moving in cycles, which ended in proclaiming that nothing beyond the province of sense is trustworthy. Or they would have buried it beneath the cares of business, or the cares of empire, or the grosser attractions of sensual pleasure. But again and again, the human heart has protested against these endeavours to crush the noblest of its aspirations. And history again and again has echoed with the cry, my soul is athirst, not for pleasures which may degrade, nor yet for philosophies which may disappoint, but for the pure, the absolute, the everlasting being. My soul is athirst for God. When shall I come to appear before the presence of God? Was this cry ever heard more distinctly by those who have ears to hear the voices of the spiritual world than in our own generation? The passion, or as the psalmist phrases it, the thirst for God, the strong desires of the soul mounting towards him with all the agonized earnestness of a disappointed and tortured sense, speaks not merely or chiefly in churches and pulpits, but in magazines, in newspapers, in social gatherings, in political assemblies, with a fervour and decision which would have startled the age of George III. The pulse of this desire is felt outside the Christian camp. It quickens the very enthusiasm of error and paradox. Often enough it makes friends for foes and foes for friends, but it is generally sincere, vehement, intolerant of delay and trifling. My soul is athirst for God, yea, even for the living God, is the desire of desires. It really underlies and explains all others that are not purely brutal in this Europe, this England of the 19th century. Let us see how it fares, this thirst for God, at the hands of some great speculative systems, which more particularly challenge attention in the present day. High in the world of thought, if we determine its place by the intellectual forces which it can at present muster, while we refuse to adopt any truer and worthier rule of measurement, lies the camp of the materialists. Materialism is sometimes digested into a system. Sometimes it is little more than an intellectual tendency. Occasionally it displays the constructive enthusiasm, together with the stiff and perhaps pedantic livery of positivism. More frequently, it is shy of committing itself to positive theories, while it is consistently earnest in resenting all attempts to base knowledge upon anything besides the verdict of sense. It bids us believe what we can see and smell and taste and touch. It invites us to make such generalizations as we can out of the report which our senses bring to us. Thus it assures us, will the mighty universe in which we live reveal itself to us, and we shall learn to perceive in it two and only two elements in the last analysis, a kingdom of matter that is apparently eternal, unceasingly, infinitely modified by eternal force. How this force and that matter came to be, it knows not. It affirms, as it denies, nothing. A philosophy that is positive does not concern itself with the origin of the universe, if it ever had one, or with what happens to living beings after their death. Of this eternal interfusion of force with matter, man himself is only a ripe and very complex product. There is nothing in him for which his chemistry cannot give an account. His intelligence is exactly proportioned to the mass of his brain. His thought is but the expression of molecular changes in the physical matter of his life. His thought is impossible without phosphorus. His consciousness is only a property of matter. His virtue is the result of a current of electricity. His virtue and his vice are strictly due to his natural organization. They are products in the same sense as sugar and vitriol. All that he can do, either with himself or with the world around him, is to search out and to register the several qualities of matter, and to number and measure the ever-shifting forms of the force which governs it. There may be something beyond matter and force, who knows? But science, which deals only with positive realities, cannot concern herself with, as she does not need, such an hypothesis as God. Can God be verified by the senses? Is he not a phantom that belongs properly to the childhood of humanity? Is he not an anachronism in a scientific age? What is he then, whom men commonly call God? God, says Feuerbach, whose pantheism is really materialism, is only the nature of man regarded as absolute truth. That which is given to man's God is in truth given to man himself. What a man declares concerning God, he in truth declares concerning himself. The divine activity is not distant from the human. In God, man has only his own activity as an object. The mystery of the inexhaustible fullness of the divine predicates is nothing else than the mystery of human nature, considered as an infinitely varied, infinitely modifiable, but consequently phenomenal being. Feuerbach in Geist des Christentums. In other words, God does not exist apart from the mind and imagination of man. He is only its creation, and has no rightful place in the region of serious and scientific thought. This is not, I trust, a misrepresentation of the language of contemporary materialism, and whatever else may be said of it, this at least is certain, that it does nothing whatever towards satisfying that great desire or thirst for communion with a higher being, of which in his best and highest moods man is so profoundly conscious. It denies, if not that any such being really exists, at least that we can know him to be really existing. They who have no satisfaction to offer to a need naturally condemn the demand for one. They who have no answer to give would rather not be questioned. And yet the religious side of man's nature is a fact of which a philosophy of experience should surely take account. Upon what is man's religious instinct to spend itself in the materialistic universe? Upon that phantom God who, as we are told, is only a pale reflection of human vanity? But the soul asks for reality and cannot occupy itself with a confessed shadow. Upon that eternal flux of self-existent matter, upon that ceaseless activity of self-existing force? But is there anything in mere force or matter, or in both combined, I will not say to satisfy a passion which is purest and strongest in saintly men, but even to have any contact with or relation towards it whatever? How can that which is purely physical touch the sense which appreciates a moral world? It is a merit of Auguste Comte to have recognized the necessity of some answer, and he tells us that it is our privilege and our business to love, reverence, and worship a being immense and eternal, humanity. Not, mark you, a sinless and divine representative of the race, such as we Christians adore in the incarnate Jesus, seated as he is at the right hand of the Father. Not even an idealized abstraction, which in the pure realm of thought might conceivably be separated from the weaknesses and degradations of the sum total of human flesh and blood. But this very collective human family itself, in all ages and all conditions, viewed as one organism, this human family, not merely illuminated by its struggles, its sufferings, its victories, but also weighted with its crimes, its brutalities, its deep and hideous degradations. It might be thought that we men know man too well to care to worship him. Yet seriously, This is the God who is to supersede the most holy Trinity when positivism has won its way to empire in European thought. Will he, think you, satisfy the mighty thirst of the human soul? What does this thirst mean but man's endeavour to escape from himself, to rise to an ideal, or rather to a reality above himself, to lose himself in a being who is greater, wiser, better than himself? Yet here he is bidden, in the name, if without the sanction of the most recent science, to seek the object of his trust and worship within himself, since nothing higher than himself is really cognizable by his understanding. It is clear that teachers who do not believe in a living God must leave one side, and that the highest, of human nature altogether uncared for, since in truth they have nothing to say to it. And history does not smile upon materialistic attempts to bribe the religious yearnings of the soul of man. Atheism could indeed, on one fatal day, throw naked vice as the goddess Reason upon the high altar of a Christian basilica, while an apostate archbishop lent his presence to the hideous ceremony. But it was one thing to obey the interested or sentimental fanaticism of the Jacobin clubs, and quite another permanently to control the heart and convictions even of the Voltairianized multitudes of Paris. The realities of religion might have been hated, but this godless parody of worship could only provoke a languid contempt. Against materialism in all its forms, the common sense of man, not to speak of his religious instinct, will ever protest. The idea or presentiment of God, everywhere rooted in the mind of man, is a fact sufficiently important to be treated as something better than a superstition by those who put forward any serious doctrine about human nature. A mental fact is as worthy of attention as any fact which can be apprised in a chemical laboratory or in the roof of an observatory. Cicero's statement that there is no nation so barbarous and wild as not to have believed in some divinity is still, notwithstanding certain apparent exceptions, true. A nation of pure atheists is yet to be discovered. Unworthy and degraded as are many of the beliefs on the subject of a higher power that are to be found in the heathen world, some groping after the great unseen, some tentative intuition, some shadowy belief there is to be found always and everywhere. Man thinks of a higher power as naturally as he thinks of the world around him or of himself. Nay, he thinks of truth, and truth is no mere abstraction. It is a real being. It is God. He thinks of the infinite, says Fenelon, as he thinks of the circle, of the line, of the distinction between whole and part. The spontaneous activity of his consciousness brings with it, contained in itself, the thought of one who is greater, if not also stronger, wiser, better than all else, and that man should in all ages and everywhere thus think of him is of itself a presumption that he really exists. This instinctive perception and affirmation of God is not indeed merely an act of the intellect. It is also, as will be insisted on presently, perhaps it is chiefly an act of the moral sense, an act of the conscience. It is that upward attraction of the soul upon which Plato dilates. It is the universal hypothesis which Aristotle registers. It is the worldwide prejudice of Epicurus. It is the anticipation naturally embedded in the human mind of Cicero. It precedes demonstration. It is out of the reach of criticism. It resists hostile argument. It is, speaking philosophically, a fact in psychological science, and a fact so fruitful and stimulating that to it must be traced all in human life and effort that looks really upward. Man's love of truth, his clinging to a coming life, his aspirations to rise above the level of an animal existence. It is, speaking religiously, in its way, a revelation. It is a revelation of God within, as St. Paul says, answering to the revelation of God from without. It sets man's thought in motion as he gazes upon the natural world and bids him not to rest until he has wrung from it a disclosure of the highest truth which it has to teach him. And thus, with this preparatory idea or intuition of a divinity, the human mind approaches what are called the proofs of God's existence. Looking out upon the universe around it, the mind seeks for its productive cause. Whatever efforts may have been made by recent writers to reduce causation to mere antecedents, the law of causation is at once a primary law of human thought and of the world without us. What cause, what force preceded and brought into existence this universe? All the causes with which we come in contact here are, as we term them, second causes, but they point to a cause beyond themselves, to a cause of causes, to a supreme, all-producing cause, itself uncaused, unoriginated. The heavenly bodies move on unceasingly in their orbits, obedient to the laws of gravitation, but no law of gravitation could have assigned them their place in space. The whole universe bids us look beyond itself for the adequate explanation of its existence. So far is it from being true, says Lord Bacon, that the explanation of phenomena by natural causes leads us away from God and his providence, that those philosophers who have passed their lives in discovering such causes can find nothing that affords a final explanation without having recourse to God and his providence. The father of the inductive philosophy does but speak the common sense of religion. But will it be maintained except by writers who are prepared to deny the existence of causation, that he does not also utter the common sense of scientific thought? Does the universe tell us anything as to the nature of its first cause? Surely we may at least presume that the author of the natural world must be higher and greater than anything in the natural world. Water will not rise above its source, and it is inconceivable that, if there be an author of nature at all, his self-existent life must not be higher and nobler than any life which he has bestowed. Who does not see the force of the psalmist's argument? He that made the ear, shall he not hear? And he that gave the eye, shall he not see? Above the life of the tree, there is that of the animal. Above that of the animal, there is the life of man. Man, with all his ingenuity and will, cannot produce a leaf or a shellfish. And is it to be supposed that the author of man's life is less endowed with thought and volition than man? We may paraphrase the psalmist, he that made the human intellect, shall he not think? And how came the intellect to exist if he did not make it? There are chasms in the natural world which no theories substituting a fated self-development for the free action of God will really bridge over. There is the chasm between the inorganic and the organic, the chasm between the lifeless and that which lives. the chasm between animal instinct and the reflective consciousness. At each of these levels of creation, we seem to feel more sensibly than elsewhere the fresh intervention of a creating intelligence. And our conviction of his activity is strengthened when we observe the interdependence and harmony of the universe as a whole, in which each part is necessary, in which nothing is really out of place, and between the several elements of which new relations are continually coming to light, as if to justify his foresight and to enhance our estimate of his inexhaustible resources. Those persons, says Montesquieu, who maintain that a blind fate has produced all the effects we see in the world, maintain that which is a great absurdity. For what absurdity can be greater than a blind fate producing intelligent beings? How do you know, a Bedouin was asked, that there is a God? In the same way, he replied, that I know on looking at the sand when a man or a beast has crossed the desert, by his footprints in the world around me. Thus does the common sense or reason of man lead him up to recognizing one supreme intelligence as at least the original cause of all that he is and sees around him. But then the question arises, what is the relation that actually subsists between this highest intelligence and the universe? To this question, there are two leading answers. The deist so far agrees with the Christian as to admit that God is related to the world as its creator, and that he must have made it out of nothing by the fiat of his will. But with this admission, momentous as it is, the old deism practically closes its account of God's free personal action upon his work. Since the creation, God's action is represented as being practically superseded by a system of unchangeable routine, and this routine is conceived to be so strictly invariable as to bind the liberty of the presumed agent. The deistic theory of the universe might remind us of the relations which, at least until some very recent events, were understood to exist between the government of Egypt and the Sublime Porte. There was occasionally a formal recognition of the sovereign power on the part of the nominal dependency, but Egypt was governed by a practically independent viceroy. The suzerain's name was mentioned rarely or only in a formal way. His active influence would have been at once resented, the real power being lodged elsewhere. According to the old deism, God created the world, but he cannot be supposed ever to interfere with the ordinary laws of its government. He cannot work miracles. He is in no tangible sense a providence. He is well out of the way of active human interests. It is not to be supposed that he can hear a prayer, the prayer of a worm writhing on one of his planets, that the happiness or misfortunes of a larger sort of animalculae can give him any real concern. So he is throned by the deistic writer in magnificent inactivity at a very remote corner of the universe, while a new power has practically taken his place. In the last century, at the first great outburst of deistic thought, nature practically superseded God. Men talked and wrote persistently about the laws of nature, the moods of nature, the religion of nature. Nature was so vividly and constantly personified in conversation and in literature that the European world might be supposed to have lighted upon a new goddess, charged in a very special sense with the interests of humanity. We live in a more positive and realistic age, and where our fathers talked of nature, modern deism names laws. What is lost in picturesqueness is gained in truth. There is no such person as nature, but there are observable modes of the divine activity, which may never vary within the experience of a race. Order is, as Christians know, a characteristic of all God's work, but He, the Almighty, is so little enslaved by the rules which He freely observes that moment by moment He wills the very order that seems to bind His liberty. Deism, however, really means by laws forces which have become somehow independent of God, fatal forces which defy His power to innovate upon their resistless play. And what can this impotent deistic God, from whose control His universe has so escaped as to constitute itself a self-governing machine, say or do to meet the aspirations or to relieve the despondencies of the human soul? If we cannot love and trust volcanic forces or vital forces, the laws of growth or the laws of decomposition, can we love and trust a being who has left this universe to itself, who surveys it, if he does survey it, in the cynicism of an unbroken silence from a very distant throne, to whom its vast oceans of hope and fear and struggle and disappointment and triumph and failure, all the mysteries of its moral life, are of no more concern than they are to the rocks and seas around us? No, the God of deism does not quench the religious thirst of the soul. The soul of man seeks the living God, not a deity who is as remote from human interests as was the Jupiter of expiring paganism. The French Revolution was fertile in religious or irreligious experiments, and as it endeavoured to satisfy the human soul with atheism, so it made yet more strenuous effort to satisfy it with deism. Robespierre had publicly declared that Chaumette deserved death for the abominations which accompanied the Feast of Reason in Notre Dame on November 7, 1793, and he took a leading part in the Feast of the Supreme Being, which was celebrated in the gardens of the Tuileries and in the Champ de Mars on June 9, 1794. The Convention decreed that he should discharge the duties of Supreme Pontiff on the occasion. The deism of Robespierre was sufficiently vivid to admit of his believing that God does rule the affairs of men. He maintained with particular earnestness that God hates kings and priests. The undeniable eloquence of the president of the convention, the art and industry of the painter David, the music, the costumes, the political enthusiasm at fever height, did all that could be done for the success of the festival. But you cannot lash a multitude into devotion to a remote and hypothetical abstraction by any elaborate display of ceremonial. And the real deity of the occasion was Robespierre. As he marched along, overshadowed with his plumes and adorned with his tricolour scarf, while the air resounded with cries of "Vive Robespierre!" his countenance, says the historian, was radiant with joy. "See how they applaud him," said his colleagues. "He would become a god. He is no longer the high priest of the Supreme Being." History does not ascribe to this attempt any special efficacy in reviving among the French people a sense of their duties towards their forgotten maker. The most tangible result of the day was the decree proposed by Couthon for increasing the powers of the Revolutionary Tribunal. To the question, what is the relation between the universe and the supreme intelligence? Another and a very different answer has been given. If deism practically banishes God from the world, pantheism at least sees what it calls God everywhere and in everything. The pantheistic God is the common principle which not only is held to constitute the unity of, but which is the universe. According to Benedict Spinoza, God is the one eternal substance which makes its appearance in the twofold realm of thought and of matter. Out of it, all individual forms of existence are constantly emerging, and like waves upon the ocean, they are as constantly sinking back into and being absorbed by it as the common stream of universal life. God alone is, says Fichte, and apart from him is nothing. A great truth in one sense, and a great falsehood in another. Hegel teaches that the absolute is the universal reason, which, after having buried and lost itself in nature, recovers itself in man, in the shape of self-conscious thought. Man's thought of God, therefore, is the true God, the only existing God. God exists only in human thought. Human thought is the reason of nature arriving at self-consciousness. Man thinks of God, and in man's thinking, God exists. He has no independent or personal existence. The great attraction and strength of pantheism lies in the satisfaction which it professes to offer to one very deep and legitimate aspiration. It endeavours to assure man of his real union with the source of his own and of the universal life. It is this profound idea, this most fascinating allurement, that can alone explain the empire which, in various ages and under various forms, pantheism has wielded in human history. It inspires Eleatic and Indian philosophies. It is the animating principle of such worship of the generative and life-sustaining powers in nature as was, for instance, that of the Phoenician Baalim. Since Lessing, Spinoza has almost reigned in certain districts of cultivated Europe, and Germany is by no means the only home of the thought of Schelling and of Hegel. In its later forms, pantheism is, speaking historically, a reaction from and a protest against the older rationalistic deism. It often represents a noble plea that God shall not be banished by modern thought from all real contact with humanity. Nay, it would fain essay to do in its way what the divine incarnation has actually done. It would make men partakers of the divine nature. And this, its religious aim, is beyond question a main secret of its power. Yet does the pantheistic deity afford any real satisfaction to the needs of the soul of man? Can he be the object of any serious religious effort whatever? What is there in him to which the life of religion can possibly attach itself? He is not a person, for pantheism necessarily denies the existence of personality. He is not a cause, for pantheism cannot tolerate any doctrine of causation. He is not even, as the absolute substance, in any wise distinct from phenomena. For while it is loyal to its central position, pantheism cannot afford to admit the correctness of such a distinction. What is he then? He is only a fine name for the universe. He has no existence apart from it. He is the universal life of which you and I are transient manifestations or forms. You may indeed encounter him draped and veiled in a phraseology so reverent and tender that it might seem to have been borrowed from the inmost shrines of Christian mysticism. But when you force yourself to look at the hard reality beneath, you find that it is practically identical with that presented by materialism. If God be in reality only the spirit of life of the spirit or life of the universe, how can he provoke the yearnings of the soul, or how satisfy its aspirations? How can he be the object, whether of religious homage or of religious trust? How can he yield love, obedience, worship to a mere torrent of existence that flows onwards inexorably beneath our feet? We, the ripples, who do but rise upon its surface to sink away after a little moment of undulation. Or how can a sensible and modest man love, trust, worship his own self-consciousness under the idea that in each reflecting mind God has become conscious of himself? Nay, if religion has anything to do with reverence for goodness and with abhorrence of moral evil, if it is not a sentiment that has been rendered by modern speculation wholly independent of moral truth, how can we worship either an inner self into which, as we must each of us know, evil penetrates so constantly and so pervadingly, or an universal life of which in its highest, that is its human manifestation, evil is, as a matter of fact, more frequently an accompaniment than good? How, I say, can such an absolute principle be the object of religion if its activity be manifested not less truly in murder and lust than in heroism and unselfishness, if the darkest forms of evil stand to it in a relation just as necessary as do the highest forms of good, if by it, in a word, all moral distinctions whatever are really annihilated? Between pantheism and an earnest hatred of moral evil, there is accordingly a necessary opposition, and this reason alone establishes a permanent divorce between it and any true effort at communion with the all-pure, such as all that is best in us enjoins. But further, that which in a Christian, as in any earnest theist, makes pantheism impossible, is the first article of his creed: I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. As the act of creation was not witnessed, so it cannot be demonstrated. By faith we understand that the worlds were made by the word of God. Creation interposes an immeasurable chasm between the creator and the creature, between that pure and awful life which is indebted to none else, either for existence or for support, and this life of dependence, weakness, corruption. And belief in creation is a necessary outwork of any true theism whatever. Deny creation and you deny God. If God in his unfettered freedom did not summon into existence all that is, if the universe escaped from him against his will, he is not alone the omnipotent. If anything that we term matter or spirit has from the beginning coexisted side by side with him, he is not alone the eternal. The difficulty is not met by phrases about the eternal idea passing into reality, since it will be asked how such a passage could have been effected, or rather why it should have taken place at all. A creative will, having no limits to its power, is at least intelligible, but the mind refuses to dwell seriously on such a process as a transmutation of thought into matter. In its attempt to explain itself, pantheism practically sinks back into materialism. It has no expedients equal to the task of saving its God from burial beneath the materialistic chaos of matter and force. Will it be said that to believe in a creator God is to close the eye of the presence of God in creation? To close the eye to the presence of God in creation? But who that believes in the omnipresent can limit his presence? Is not the original act of creation a warrant for the Creator's continued presence with and action upon his work? The apostle who taught the Athenians that God made the world and all things therein, taught them also, and in the same great sermon, that he is not far from every one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. To assert God's presence in his works is one thing. To identify him with them is another. His omnipresence is a necessary attribute of his deity, while if he could be identified with nature, he would cease to be. If the mystery of life, which attests God's presence in the natural world, was ever felt in all its awe and its beauty by any human soul, it was felt by the great Augustine. Witness the often quoted passage of the Confessions, in which he tells us why nature was in his eyes so beautiful, by telling us how nature had led him up to God. I asked the earth, and it said, I am not he. And all that is upon it made the same confession. I asked the sea and the depths and the creeping things that have life, and they answered, We are not thy God. Look thou above us. I asked the breezes and the gales, and the whole air with its inhabitants said to me, Anaximenes is in error. I am not God. I asked the heaven, the sun, the moon, the stars. We too, said they, are not the God whom thou seekest. And I said to all the creatures that surround the doors of my fleshly senses, You have said to me of my God that ye are not he. Tell me somewhat of him. And with a great voice they exclaimed, He made us. So long as the human mind only conceives of God as a supreme intelligence, it will oscillate hesitatingly between these two errors, between a sterile deism, which banishes God from the world, and a reactionary pantheism, which buries him in it. It is when we gain a height beyond and observe the third great form of argument with which man clothes and fortifies his presentiment of God that we are saved from this liability. Here a view of God's nature opens out upon us, which is at once conservative of his moral purity and distinctness from created life, and also does justice to the intimacy of his contact with the world and with humanity. The philosopher of Königsberg, who in his Critique of Pure Reason has made the most of some well-known objections against those arguments for God's existence which are drawn from the existence and structure of the universe, insists with great force upon the strength of the inference by which the human conscience ascends to the recognition of God. If Kant is a skeptic in the domain of speculative thought, his doubts vanish altogether when, entering that of the practical reason, as he terms it, he listens to the commands of moral truth. This practical reason is wholly independent of any discovery or decision external to itself. It apprehends the good as much without waiting for the judgment of experience. It apprehends the good as such without waiting for the judgment of experience. Its commands are issued without limit or reserve. They have an objective certainty. They judge all things while they themselves are judged of no man. They lead us to recognize as necessary truths, first, the freedom of man's will, next, a future life, thirdly, the existence of God. The voice of the practical reason, thou oughtest, implies thou canst. The categorical imperative is meaningless in the absence of moral freedom. Man is free, and his conscience perpetually affirms that he must do good at all costs, even although doing good should not make him happy. It affirms no less clearly that if he is really virtuous, he should be happy. Yet in the experience of life, the good man who does good is often unhappy, while vice is not unfrequently salaried and crowned with rewards that are denied to virtue. The sight of this contradiction forces the conscience to infer a life to come, and a moral being who, in his justice, will re-establish those relations between happiness and virtue which it persistently recognizes as necessary. Thus the practical reason reaches God not by a demonstration of his existence, but as a postulate of its own activity. Speculation may mislead, but duty is a certainty, and duty is no arbitrary creation either of our reason or of our self-interest. It is not an abstraction which rests on nothing beyond itself. It is out of the reach of merely speculative criticism, yet it leads us to the master of the moral world. Those clear, precise, categorical orders, which are imposed in varying degrees of urgency upon all human wills, point to a really living ruler of men, in whom man cannot disbelieve without doing violence to himself. Certainly Kant would have had little patience with the theory that conscience itself is only a collection of prejudices received from childhood and incorporated with the moral life, that it is simply the result of early training and has no real basis in the soul. For this theory confuses the furniture of the conscience with the conscience itself, the acquisitions of a faculty with its existence. It might be contended with equal justice that the human mind does not exist because it is developed by exercise and enlarged by information. Certainly conscience may be enlightened, or it may be misinformed by education, but the original faculty which perceives the existence of some right and of some wrong, whatever, may be apprehended as such, and which refers actions to such right and wrong. The faculty which under all circumstances pronounces in favour of truth and justice and self-sacrifice and courage and purity wherever they can be found, because it intuitively perceives their necessary excellence, this faculty demands God. Conscience is unsatisfied, according to Kant, unless there exists some being above the world who can hereafter reconcile the discrepancies which exist between virtue and fortune in this present life, in his quality of an arbiter of human conduct. Here atheism, especially in its positivist guise, pleads the disinterestedness of real virtue, which is good and does good for the sake of goodness, seeking no reward and daunted by no misfortune. But when Kant maintains that there must be a moral God, he does this not in the interests of a mercenary virtue, but in those of an absolute and consummate justice, which proclaims in every human conscience the necessity of establishing some harmony or correspondence between the conditions of human existence on the one hand and man's demerits or deserts on the other. Thus it is that conscience demands God, and the atheistic whisper in the fool's heart of which the psalmist speaks belongs in truth to moral rather than to intellectual folly. It is ultimately traceable to a failure to perceive and feel the mighty and abiding contrast which exists between moral good and moral evil, and the necessary bearing of this contrast upon the ultimate destinies of the universe. In a good man, belief in God results from belief in the invincibility of good. The intensity or feebleness of a man's belief in God is a spiritual thermometer, whereby the temperature of his moral being may be pretty accurately measured. When the moral sensibilities are weakened or blunted by culpable indulgence until known sin is tolerable or even welcome, then the intellect is always open to theories which represent good and evil as alike forms of the universal life, or as equally fatal results of that unreasoning and irresistible piece of machinery which we name the universe. But although the human conscience is an earnest theistic apologist in exact proportion to its vitality, its affirmation of God should not be divorced from the intellectual inferences which the universe suggests to us. The evidential strength of theism, like that of Christianity, lies not in any single proof, but in the collective force of the various evidences which are producible in its favour, and of these the cry of conscience, if the strongest practically, is after all only one. Nor does it follow that because conscience is a true guide towards the throne of a living and a moral God, it is therefore an infallible judge in reviewing all that he may reveal to us about himself or the laws of his government. We may reasonably accept the witness of the universal conscience of good men in favour of theism, without binding ourselves to accept all that has been pleaded by individuals in the name of conscience against portions of the Jewish history, for example, or the doctrine of the atonement. If it be urged from another side that it is, after all, the conscience of fallen man upon which we rely for this great affirmation of God, the reply is that the fall cannot have destroyed our powers of apprehending truth, or it would have destroyed our responsibility, and that it is not the weakness which the fall has wrought in human nature, but the strength which still survives it, whereby man affirms the existence of a moral God and seeks him. So far as man is a fallen being, no doubt at the approach of the Lord God, he hides himself amid the trees of the garden to the end of time. But those truth-seeking elements of his spiritual nature, which, as the Christian creed teaches, were in paradise invigorated by a robe of supernatural grace, afterwards forfeited by the sin of our first parents, are throughout heathendom still kindled into activity by the prevenient grace of the Holy Spirit, breathing as he wills across the deserts. And thus fallen man seeks the Lord, if haply he might feel after him, and find him, though he be not far from every one of us, instinctively assured, as all good men must be, of his existence, and hoping that he may be fully unveiled at last. Yet the feebleness of conscience in fallen man is a fact of significance. Although conscience seeks in God not merely, as does intellect, a solution of the problem of the universe, but a legislator who has given and who will enforce the law of right and wrong written in the human heart, conscience is nevertheless, in the mass of men, if left to itself, too enfeebled to keep a moral God clearly in view, even when it has caught sight of him. It requires an aid external to itself, a token from its object that it is not mistaken about him. It requires a revelation. Without a revelation, historical theism is either the fruitless speculation of a few isolated thinkers, or the underlying idea of a popular superstition which obscures and degrades it. In a certain true sense, it is itself a revelation, but its utterances require a countersign in the world without, which may make it certain that the inner legislator is also the ruler of the universe. Conscience itself, exactly in the ratio of the clearness with which it discerns the moral nature of God, discerns the implied necessity of a revelation. It is sure that he who is himself just and merciful cannot leave men altogether to themselves, that the all-good cannot permanently disappoint the desires and powers which he has himself implanted. And thus the antecedent probability of a revelation is to a good man not less than overwhelming, and Christianity assures us that his conviction is warranted by the fact. The substance of the Christian revelation of God consists not merely in the teaching of Jesus Christ, together with the old Hebrew literature on which he sets his seal, and the apostolical doctrines which he warrants by anticipation, but also in his life. His life was an unveiling of God to the eye of man's sense, that the eye of man's spirit might understand him. Christ's life, not less than his teaching, confirms the highest instincts of the human conscience, and educates them up to a point which of themselves they could never have reached. But how is man enabled to identify the author of this law within him, perfectly reflected as it is in Jesus Christ, with the author of the law of the universe without him? The answer is by a miracle. Miracle is an innovation upon physical law, or at least a suspension of some lower physical law by the intervention of a higher one, in the interests of moral law. The historical fact that Jesus Christ rose from the dead identifies the Lord of physical life and death with the legislator of the Sermon on the Mount. Miracle is a certificate of identity between the Lord of nature and the Lord of conscience, the proof that he is really a moral being who subordinates physical to moral interests. Miracle is the meeting point between intellect and the moral sense, because it announces the answer to the efforts and yearnings alike of the moral sense and the intellect, because it announces revelation. It may be asked whether miracle in revealing God is not subversive of the idea of God whom it reveals. Does it not postulate in him two contradictory wills, the one whereby he enacts a permanent law, the other whereby he suspends it? And is not this irreconcilable with the highest views of his nature as the immutable, who is what he is unchangeably, because what he is absolutely the best? No, for this is to apply to the divine mind a human standard of measurement. Succession is a law of human thoughts, because the mind of man is finite. If I resolve to spend each day for the next 6 months in a given way, and then 3 months hence determine that I will spend one particular day very differently, I am without doubt guilty of traversing my original and general intention by a second and particular intention which contradicts it. But with God no such self-contradiction is possible, because in the divine mind there is no succession, whether of ideas or resolves. The eternal being sees the end in the beginning. He sees the exception together with the rule so simultaneously that it is untrue to say that he anticipates it. It is a simple, indivisible act of will, whereby he everlastingly wills the rule together with the exception with the rule. With him is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. The idea that God, in working a miracle, contradicts his own earlier purpose is giving to the physical world unchangeable laws, not merely betrays a conception of law as something independent of the free activity of God, but introduces into our conception of the divine mind the finite and human idea of a succession in thought and will. Whereas in truth, he, the infinite, embraces by one single act, present, past, and future, the general and the particular, the individual and the universal, reaching, as the wise man says, from one end to another, mightily and smoothly and sweetly ordering all things. But does God compromise his dignity by working a miracle, or by exerting a special providence over his works? It is pleaded indeed that he must do so. It is said to be inconceivable that the maker and monarch of all these suns can interest himself in the concerns of one of the smallest of his planets, in a particular race of creatures on its surface, in individual members of that race, in you and me. To imagine this, we are told, is only to indulge human self-love, which interprets all things, even the deity himself, by the promptings of its own boundless self-complacency. And yet what kind of dignity is it which is thus pleaded in order to depreciate the freedom, energy, and ubiquity of God's providential rule? It is at best the dignity of an oriental despot. He is too engrossed in the cares of personal government or in the pursuits of personal indulgence to listen to the voices and to study the wants of the poor, who struggle and suffer around the walls of his seraglio. The notion that a really great intelligence will concern itself only and exclusively with broad principles and general interests to the neglect of particulars and details is, even when we are speaking of human minds, a mistaken notion. This vulgar contempt for details belongs to the pretentious imitation rather than to the reality of mental power. A really great intelligence combines the observation and study of details with a firm grasp of comprehensive principles. And in this power of combining things, which in lower minds are found apart, lies the strength and secret of its greatness. Nor is this less, rather it is much more the case with the eternal mind. God is not less divine in literally numbering the sparrows that fall to the ground and the hairs of the human head, than in formulating the highest laws which govern either planetary systems or spiritual intelligences. While this comprehensive and penetrating interest and action, spreading itself upon the whole outward and inward life of his creatures, is the symptom and expression of the moral interest which the reasonable creation commands in the heart of the Creator. No, God's greatness is not enhanced by systems which would banish him from the world or condemn him to impotence. The miracles of Christianity are so far from compromising its theism that they illustrate and secure it. The God of Christianity is no mere first cause or supreme intelligence. He is a moral God. If he is power and wisdom, he is also sanctity, justice, providence, mercy, love. According to the gospel, love is his essence, and love is interest in and self-sacrifice for that which is its object. It is such a God as this who can alone be the adequate object of religion. Traceable everywhere in human history, traceable especially in the history of one separated and chosen race, the interest of the perfect moral being in the moral and thinking creatures of his hand culminates at Bethlehem and on Calvary. The incarnation of the eternal Son, the manifestation of the divine life of love and justice and compassion and purity, flashing through a veil of flesh and leading up to a death of agony and shame, which alters the whole existing moral relation between earth and heaven. This is the glorious creed which rivets a Christian's conviction of the moral intensity of the life of God. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. What could he do more in order to convince us that he is not merely a force or an intelligence, but a heart? At the feet of him who could say, "He that hath seen me hath seen the Father," we understand and rest upon the certainty that God is moral as well as intellectual, light, and that in him is no darkness at all. When a man's hold upon this creed is gone, his thought falls back at best upon the more rudimentary and less adequate ideas of the Godhead. The darker mysteries of the world's history present themselves with more painful force, and the mind tends inevitably, in the last resort, either to deism or to pantheism, to a deism which just permits God to create and then dismisses him from his creation, or to a pantheism which identifies him with all the moral evil in the universe and ends by propagating the worship of new Baals and Ashtaroths. A few words in conclusion. God being really alive, his existence is a fact with which no other fact that the human mind can come to recognize will possibly compare. Nothing among created things that can engage and stimulate thought, nothing that can warm and expand affection, nothing that can invigorate will and purpose ought, in the judgment of any thinking human being, to compete with the eternal God. Our reasonable duty towards God is to believe in him, to fear him, and to love him with all the heart, with all the mind, with all the soul, and with all the strength. And yet that unbegun, unending, self-existent life, that boundless intelligence administering a boundless power, that long array of moral attributes which win our love while they must also move our reverence and fear, what is he, our God, to us? Do we thirst for God? As the days and months and years pass, do we ever look out of and beyond ourselves upon that vast ocean of uncreated life which encircles us, which penetrates our inmost selves? Do we ever think steadily, so as to dwell with a real intellectual interest upon him who is the first and highest of truths, to whose free bounty we ourselves owe the gift of existence, and to whom we must one day account for our use of it? Do we ever sincerely desire to love him and to live for him? Or are we constantly hurrying along our solitary path from one vanishing shape towards another, while we neglect the alone unchangeable? Be sure that, if we will, in God revealed in Christ, the soul may slake the thirst of the ages, and the dreariest and darkest and most restless existence may find illumination and peace. This God is our God forever and ever. He will be our guide unto death and beyond it. To each one of us now, he is, if we will. If we will, he will be forever, to each the eternal truth, wherein thought can never find its limit. the uncreated beauty, most ancient yet always fair, whereof affection can never tire, the perfect rule, existing eternally in the life of the necessary moral being, whereunto each created will may perpetually conform itself, yet never exhaust its task. Without this awful and blessed being, man has no adequate object, even during these days of his brief earthly existence. His thought, his affection, his purpose spring up and are exercised, only that they may presently waste and die. With God, the human soul not merely interprets the secret of the universe, it comprehends and is at peace with itself. For God is the satisfaction of its thirst. He is the object of religion.